So the question relates to the research we are doing at the racetrack. These are thoroughbred racehorses that are racing in Indiana, near Indianapolis, at the center at the Shelbyville racetrack, Indiana Grand. And our interest was to try to first, document how frequent is it for horses to have, mild asthma, and then, what is causing it. And so we attempted, to understand that by looking at different, possibilities. We thought, well, certainly exposure to irritants such as dust, and then what is in the dust that might potentially make it more irritating, such as endotoxin or presence of moles. So we wanted to explore that. And also we wanted to look at the possibility of infection playing a role as a trigger. So both viral infection, viruses obviously are common in racehorses, viral infections. And then also we wanted to look at the possibility of bacterial infection, causing or triggering episodes of mild asthma, once the infection is over, that might lead to that. So we explore all these aspects. This was a grant funded by the Grace and Jockey Club Research Foundation. And so we published actually our results of the first 2-year study in 2018 in the Journal of Vet Internal Medicine. And what was very interesting was, first of all, we found that there was a really high percentage of horses that had low-grade airway inflammation, so low-grade equine asthma. Actually, 80% of thoroughbreds had that amount. So from, really mild to a bit more moderate level of airway inflammation. And what was very interesting, and obviously why it showed it was important to detect it, is because the more inflammation they had in the airway, the more impact and negative impact it had on their performance. So really related essentially the inflammation to the performance, and so that performance declined as inflammation increased. So clearly there was kind of a dose effect, and we showed that there was some cutoff above which that starts being a problem. So it's for practitioners, it's important to know that. And this was based on lung wash, or BAL cytology. We found that this is the best way to detect it. So that was point number one. So highly prevalent or common in racehorses and negatively affects their performance. So it's important to do something about it, and to be able to do something about it, you need to know what is causing it. So that was the rationale for looking at the potential causes. We haven't published yet the results on the infectious side, but it looks like it's not a big factor, and both on the virus and the bacterial infection. And again, those horses never had, fevers and things like that, and again, felt normal. What we found very interestingly is that dust exposure was associated with airway inflammation, and not all kind of dust. And that was very important for us. We measured, the different sizes of dust. You have very large particles that you can actually see, and these are large particles, over, 50 to 100 micron. They are, the size of a human hair diameter is about, 50 to 100 micron. Those are visible. And unfortunately, the visible dust was not related to airway inflammation at all. But what was strongly associated with airway inflammation was what we call respirable dust, which are very small particles you cannot see with the naked eye, that are 5 micron and below. And because they are small, they can go deeper in the airway, and we think that's why they can cause airway irritation. And what was really interesting is those small dust particles were associated with one particular form of airway inflammation. So there are different type of cells that can be associated with airway inflammation or cause it. And in this case, the neutrophils were the one associated with the very small dust particles. There was another type of airway inflammation that was fairly common in racehorses, caused by mast cells, we call them. And those were not associated with the small dust particles, but were associated with what we call beta-glucan concentration, which tells us something about how much mold they might be inhaling. And we think of it with mast cells of more of a true allergic response of the airway versus the neutrophil. We think of it more of an irritant. So a slightly different mechanism, if you will, but both essentially related to what horses inhaled. And we think that why we were able to detect that effects because we did our measurement of dust exposure right around the nose of the horse, what we call the breathing zone. So we had samplers or sensors right around the horse's halter, the nose band, if you will. And they were wearing that in the stall where they were going about their business, eating, etc. We were equipping these horses after they came back from the training session. We're back in the stall and then we're fed. And that's where when we did the measurement over, 6 hours, so a long period of time, just to get a good sense of how much, they were exposed to. So essentially this study, showed us, first of all, as I mentioned, marlasma is very common in racehorses. It really has a negative impact on their performance. And third, really what's triggering it is the small dust particles they were exposed to.